Thank you for joining us for the awkward portion of tonight's Bible study as we try and figure out if it's actually filming or not. Glad you all joined us. You virtually speaking at home. Thank you for joining us as we continue to look through the book of First Corinthians. So last Wednesday, we did 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And in chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, it's dealing with Christians and how they interact with one another and how that interaction is portrayed to the world around them, and dealing with lawsuits. Christians shouldn't, for minor civil issues, Christians shouldn't take Christians to court to be ruled over by somebody that doesn't care anything about God. They should instead have people to handle that, smart people in the church that are wise, that can oversee things like that. So that was the first part, and then sexual immorality was the last part of that, which launches into chapter 7. Now remember, when this was written, it was not written with big numbers for chapter designations and little numbers for verse designations. It was written as one big long letter. We added those to make finding references easier through the years, and so as many times you move from one chapter to the next chapter, it's just kind of a continuation of a previous thought. And so that's where we're at tonight. He launched into the tail end of chapter 6 with the sexual immorality, leading into chapter 7, which he's going to be dealing with marriage. Now remember, God defined marriage. He defined what that looks like. That's our definition. He was using sexual immorality first, and that's everything that God didn't design, or everything outside of God's design. And now he's bringing it in a little closer to everything that God did design, talking about sex, and that's marriage. So let's jump right into it. Chapter 7 verse 1 says, "Now the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry." Two things. First off, it is now about the matters that you wrote. Again, I've said this about every week. There's not a lot, but there are times in the Bible, especially through Corinthians, where Paul will reference some knowledge, and it is common knowledge to Paul and the Corinthians. It's not common knowledge to us. We don't know what other letters have transpired back and forth between the two, but obviously they had a question about something, and so he's addressing it. He says, "Now for the matters that you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry." So why on earth would Paul say that it's good for a man not to marry when God even tells Adam and Eve, all right, now a man shall leave a woman, a man shall leave his mother and father, be united with his wife, the two will become one flesh. So how do we get from God designed marriage to now it's good for you if you don't marry? Put things in context. In Corinth at this time, there was a lot of turmoil, especially for the Christians. They were living in a completely immoral society. One of the biggest temples that they had available to the pagan gods there in Corinth involved the worship, or the way that you would worship that deity is that you would get a prostitute in the temple, and there was literally a temple that had thousands of temple prostitutes, and so that's how they would worship that particular deity, the pagan deity. And so they're living in a culture that is very un-Christian. They're living in a culture that is very sexually charged. There's a lot of temptation, this, that, and the other. What Paul's saying is he's not defying God and saying, well, God got it wrong, you really shouldn't get married. What he's saying is, if you can be single, it's probably better for you. Not because you get to go play golf more because you're not married, but because of there's enough pressures on a Christian in this world that it is amplified when you add a wife to that, and then ultimately you add kids to that, and all. Not that those are burdens, but if life is tough for a Christian to remain a Christian with the pressures that a single person has, you can only imagine that the pressures of being the spiritual head of a house would be even greater if you added a wife and kids on top of that. And so all Paul is saying here is like, if you can choose it, it's better for you to have to go through all this if you are single. But, he says, chapter or verse 2, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Ideally, in a perfect world, in this situation, it'd be best if you could get through it single and focus and dedicate yourself to the Lord. But since you're living in this sexually charged world anyway, and temptation is so great for immorality, men, find your wife, find your man. And that way you're not tempted to go into be involved in the worldly immorality that was around them. He says the husband should fulfill, and so he continues with that thought. He says it'd be good for you to be unmarried, but the way things stand, men, you need to get a wife. Women, you need to get a husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The marital duty is the church fancy proper way of saying sex. So the husband, he needs to fulfill his duty to his wife. Wife likewise fulfill her duty to the husband. Now, why is this? And again, a lot of times when we talk about sex, things like that, we snicker and giggle and all kinds. But you know what? God, in His great area of our life, I really believe that the Bible addresses every single area of our life. What He wants from us in those areas, sex is one of those things. Matter of fact, we talked about it Sunday night, that out of the 66 books in the Bible, one of them was dedicated completely to how God wanted husbands and wives to fulfill their duties to one another and how that marriage could glorify God. So it's a cool thing. So snickers out of the way. This is going to be dealing, the purpose of this is so that they would remain sexually pure. He says it'd be better off if you could be single. But I understand this world around you is completely sexually charged. The immorality, temptation is going to be too great. So the best thing that you can do, men, find a wife, women, find a husband, so that you can meet those physical needs with each other and not have to go the way of sexual immorality. Does that make sense? Clear as mud? Good. Says verse 4, he says the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. The same way the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Again, he's talking about in the situation that they live in, you are better off going down God's path of being married so that you aren't tempted to run out into the world and to be involved in sexual immorality. Verse 5, and he continues on with this. He said, this is how important it is. In verse 5, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and only for a time, so that you can devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul is a super smart guy. He is getting wisdom straight from God, and he is speaking it as plain as it can be. The temptation, sexual temptation is so great that you as Christians need to find Christian spouses so that you can fulfill those needs with each other and not be tempted to go into the world to find those things. And that's how affairs happen. That's how divorces happen. And so he's safeguarding the marriage. I do want to address something here because it's something that I've heard a lot, and it's always said in jest, but I really think we probably need to figure out another way to be funny and not use this phrase. Have you ever heard anybody say, well, I tell you what, you're going to be on the couch tonight? I hear that a lot. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 5. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent, and then only for a time, so that you can what? Punish them? No. Prayer. You can dedicate yourself to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Sex was never meant to be used as a bargaining chip. And I hear this joked about a lot, and the fact of the matter is it's not funny, because that is actually something, I'm not blaming, again, I'm not a a wife who stops having sex with her husband, it's not her fault that if the husband goes and cheats on her. But I will say this: Paul's very clear here that if you are deprived of something, the temptation is very great to go seek it elsewhere. Now, the fault is on the husband, obviously, for committing adultery, but there is also a layer of culpability there on that couple to make sure that they're doing things that couples are supposed to be doing as God tells them to do. And Paul's very clear here. Why? He says so that you won't be tempted by Satan because you got lack of self-control. Now, I know some of you listening to this right now probably don't like that part, but again, I know it's said in jest, he better get me that new pair of shoes or he's going to be sleeping on the couch. You know what? You probably need to figure out a different way to be funny, because that is absolutely contrary to the Bible. There is no other way to say it that contradicts what the Bible says. And so we need to be careful how we joke about that. And then also, if it's not joking, we need to make sure that we don't leverage sex and our bodies, things like that, to punish our spouse. That does not honor God, and it can, not all the time, but it can lead to some problems down the road. So let's figure out another way to be funny, or let's figure out another way to for couples to communicate what they're wanting and not use sex as a bargaining chip. He says, verse 6, I say this as a concession, not as a command. Here's what he's going to say. I wish that all men were as I am. But each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. All right. So he said all this, and then he goes, I'm going to tell you something as a concession. It's not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am. Now, what is he? There is the overwhelming thought and the overwhelming evidence shows that Paul was single. That Paul was not married, didn't have a wife. And a lot of people believe that he was just this confirmed bachelor, that for his whole life he had dedicated himself to God, and that there was never a woman in his life, and even to the point where a lot of people think that he hates women, that kind of thing. And if you believe that, that's great. I will say this: there's at least enough evidence in Scripture for me to make an argument that Paul was at one time married. And I'm going to give you a few of those clues. Now, let me tell you this right now. It doesn't matter if you agree with me or not. If I'm right, anybody out of heaven for believing what they believe about Paul's marital status. But it's important. I think it does bear into a lot of his teachings that this is coming from a wisdom of somebody that may have experienced these things. So there's at least enough evidence to argue that Paul was at one time married. Now, why don't we hear about his wife? Well, I don't think she was there. And what could that mean? Well, maybe she left him when he became a Christian. Perhaps she had died. Probably think that's what it is, and I'll get there in just a second. But anyway, regardless, Paul is now going to give some instructions to people who are married, people who are widowers and widows, and so he's going to hit a lot of hot spots here about marriage and the way God designed it, and how we need to protect that thing. Remember, if our marriages can absolutely glorify God, then that means we need to be doing godly things within our marriages in order for it to honor God. That's how we treat each other. That's how the world sees our relationship. So, all right. He says, verse 7, I wish all men were as I am. Now, go to verse 8. He says, to the unmarried and the widows. Now, he's going to talk to two different groups of people. He says, the unmarried and the widows. Why would he include unmarried people who have never been married, to widows? Why would he lump them together? This is one of those textual nuances where if you look at it and you start to kind of break it apart, you might see something that you never saw before. Let me tell you that in the Greek language, there is no word for widower. There's no widower in Scripture. Remember last week we talked about that in the pagan cultures, in the Roman culture, Greek culture, a lot of not Christian cultures, the women were defined by being married. That was their source of income. That was their identity. That was who produced in them the children that would keep the family going. Their identity was made up of being married. Their source of income, property, everything. When a woman was divorced, she retained no property. She retained no income, no source of income. Everything was based on her husband. So the word widow would define someone who had lost this situation in life. And if if you're defined by who you're married to and you lose that person that you're married to, that makes you a widow if you're a woman. Since there is no Greek word for widower, there was actually a phrase that they used. It was called unmarried. And the unmarried were men. This is a masculine word, unmarried. The men who had lost their wives did not lose their possessions, did not lose their property, did not lose their identity. They didn't lose anything in that except their wife. It didn't change their position in the culture. They weren't widowers. So this is the first bit of evidence that we see that Paul, there at least, again, there was enough evidence to argue that at one time he was married. He says, I wish that you were as I am. And then who does he talk to right after that? Widowers and widows, right? Okay. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried. What's he say? As I am. He's not talking to people who have never been married here. He's talking to people who have been married, but through the death of their spouse are single now. As I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. I love that. It's so funny. He says, you know what? If you're married and your husband dies or your wife dies, you're better off staying unmarried, focusing on your relationship with the Lord and going through life as you are at that moment. But if you can't control yourself, then you need to go find a husband or a wife, and so you can get married. And he says it is better to marry than to burn with passion. That is funny to me. To the married, so he talks to the unmarried and the widows, and then he talks to the married. He says, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. If she must not separate from her husband. A woman could not initiate the divorce. Only the man could. The only thing she could do is separate. He says a woman must not separate from her husband. If you do, don't marry anybody else. You focus on getting your relationship with your husband reconciled so that you can get back together. And then you think to yourself, well, that's awful mean. I can't believe he would do that to women. Well, what does he say? He says the very next sentence, and a husband must not divorce his wife. Why does he say husband can't divorce? Because the husbands are the ones that had to initiate the divorce. A woman couldn't do it. The most she could do is separate. So he's saying it's equal here. He's saying to both men and women, husbands and wives, don't get divorced. Don't get divorced. If you do separate, work on getting it back together. Work on reconciling. Verse 12, to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. All right, who's he talking to? He's talking to people who are not Christians, who are married, and one of them becomes a Christian. If one of them becomes a Christian and the spouse doesn't, do not get a divorce. The best thing you can do is stay there. If they're willing to stay with you in this relationship, one of the best things you can do is stay with them so that they can see Christ in you, and hopefully that they themselves will find the Lord. And if you know, I know several people who have been in this situation. We've referred to them throughout ministry, my time in ministry. We've referred a lot of times to spiritual widows. Those are women who come to church regularly. They're super involved. Maybe even the kids come with them, but the husband doesn't. And what Paul's saying here is, you know what? If that husband is willing to stay with you, stay with them. Don't get a divorce. Stay with them, so that ultimately they might see the Lord. Now, if you're like me, you know of instances where you know of people who have done this, and you of women who brought those kids to church faithfully, and she came to church faithfully herself, and then lo and behold, what happened? Before long, you look up, and there you see your husband sitting with her, and then he's involved, and then he becomes a Christian. Wow, what if she had gotten a divorce right off the bat? What kind of influence would that have had? So what Paul's saying here is, if you're not a Christian, but you're married and one of you becomes a Christian, stay with your spouse, because you might be able to show them who the Lord is. Verse 15 says, "But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace." What does that mean? It means the only time that it's okay for an unbelieving couple to separate is if the unbeliever deserts the believer. If you are like me, you probably know people in those instances as well. And what Paul says is very true here. He says, you know what? If you are deserting, if your spouse leaves you, their unbelieving spouse leaves you because of your faith, you are not bound in that situation to that husband. You're basically, this is one of those allowances that God gives for divorce. You've got adultery and you've got desertion, where somebody deserted their spouse. In that situation, you are free and clear. He says, verse 16 says, "How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will?" That's referring back to if you become a Christian after you're already married, both of you are unbelievers, one of them, stay with them, because how do you know that you won't be able to lead that person to the Lord? And wow, what a great testimony if that's the case. And I know several cases like that. It's always neat to see. Verse 17 says, "Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is a rule I lay down in all the churches." This is not solely about marital position, whether single or married or divorced. This is not about that. If you want a very clear picture of what he's going to be talking about, you can read through the book of Philippians. We'll get there in just a second. But what he's saying here, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him, means you need to find where you're at in whatever situation. And this is not just talking about marriage status. How do we know? Verse 18. "Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised." Remember, one of the big debates throughout the early church is Jews who had converted to Christianity, Jews who were circumcised on the 8th day who had converted to Christianity, and then these pagans, Gentiles, are coming into the church, becoming Christians. Some of the Jews who had converted to Christianity said, "Well, we had to be circumcised. You got to get circumcised." And there was a big, huge discussion over whether or not people that accepted the Lord and were baptized needed to also get circumcised. The early church dealt with that in depth and said, "No, you ain't got to do all that mess. It doesn't have anything to do with circumcision anymore." And that's what Paul is referring to here. He says, "Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised." I got news for you. You can't go backwards on that deal. Once it's done, it's done. You can't undo that. And that's the point, that it's kind of, he picked this crazy, this crazy analogy of course you're not going to do that. And he says, "Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised." We've already dealt with that. Verse circumcision. God's commands is what counts. Woo! Underline that one, highlight that one, put stars by it. These little bitty things that we all find ourselves fighting and getting in Facebook discussions over, and all these idiotic things that don't matter to don't count up to a hill of beans, they are meaningless and take so much of our time in arguing about. Well, they should worship the way we worship. Well, they shouldn't have that band, or they should have that band. I can't believe that they've got a projector in their church. I can't believe that they don't wear three-piece suits to church. All these weird things that we find ourselves beating each other up over are meaningless. They're just as meaningless as fighting over whether you should be circumcised or you should be uncircumcised. They don't matter. What counts? He says, keeping God's commands is what counts. One should remain in the situation which he was when God called him. This is everything to do with being content. Philippians, especially chapter 4. This is what he's talking about, being content in all situations. Whether you have much, whether you have little, whether you're a slave, whether you're free, whether you are married, whether you're unmarried, whether you got a big house, all of these things is what Paul's talking about in this context is wherever you find yourself, you need to be content in that moment. Do you think the world would look different if people learned what it meant to be content? That's a no-brainer, right, Rich? Yeah, everybody. Think how different the world would be if people weren't jealous of other people, or if people weren't mean to others because they were envious or mad or judgmental, or think about all those things that go along with being discontent or uncontent. If the world learned what it meant to be content, it would certainly be a different place. Verse 21, he says, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man is responsible to God, should remain in the situation that God called him to. Again, this doesn't have as much to do with your marriage status as it does to, in your place in life, learn this a billion times. I will say it a billion more as long as God gives me breath. So many times we miss what God has given us right in front of our nose because we're looking so far down the road for what we ain't got. Fact of the matter is, God has blessed us more than we deserve, right? And if we can learn and train ourselves to see what God has blessed us with in whatever situation we find ourselves, we'll learn what it means to be content. He says, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remember. This is something else that we're not 100% clear on. He says, because of this present crisis. 100% what that is. A lot of people believe that he's talking about the difficulty of Christians remaining Christians in such a pagan world. It's like rampant immorality surrounding them. It's very difficult. He says, now it'd be great because of what's going on that are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Again, he's going back to, if you get to pick, if you could do it, stay single. Not because marriage is burdensome or because marriage is the ball and chain, and not that kind of thing, but because it's hard enough to stay when you just have to worry about yourself. But then if you take the added responsibility to being spiritual head of the house or parents to children raising in the world, now you've just lumped on more hardship. Again, it's not a bad thing. It's just the way the world is. It's more stress. It's more concern. And he says, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers, is that time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, and those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. It's all going away. Whether it goes away tomorrow or goes away 100 years from now, it's all going away. And we should be fixated not on the temporal things that are here today and gone tomorrow, but fixated on the more important things. What are the more important things? Keeping God's commands is what counts. Fixating on godly things, fixating on kingdom things, fixating on our relationship with the Lord. Verse 32 says, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs. How can he please the Lord? But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. Again, he's not saying these are bad things. He's just saying it's a reality of, for people who are married, your interests are now divided, because you have to, if you're going to honor the Lord in your marriage, you have to now concern yourself with other people in this relationship. Husband, wife, kids. He says, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, undivided devotion to the Lord. This to the extreme is why you have nuns and priests in the Catholic Church. They don't marry. They don't seek a spouse. In their minds, they are married to the Lord. They're married to the church. Nuns married to the Lord. Priests married to the Lord. Not seeking out a spouse, but devoting all of their time to the Lord. Now you can go on your tangents about whether that works or not. That's another sermon. That my point is that is to an extreme taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where people are devoting themselves completely to the Lord's service and not getting married. Verse 36 says, if anyone thinks he's acting improperly towards a virgin he's engaged to, if she's getting along in years and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning. They should get married. Remember, in these days and age, the betrothal period, the engagement period, would last for sometimes a very lengthy time. Sometimes they can last for years and years and years before they ever get married. Now, legally, they're bound to one another, but the only thing they're not doing is having sex. They're not living together. They're living separately, but economically, socially, they are considered to be married. And what he's saying here is, if you're in this situation where you're in the betrothal period, your wife, the virgin that you're betrothed to get married to, she's getting up on years, you are going to get married in the first place, go ahead and get married. You haven't sinned. You haven't done anything wrong. Go ahead and get married. He says, but the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man does right. But he who does not marry the virgin does even better. Now, again, not saying that marriage is bad. What he's go back to everything we've been talking about for the purpose of being able to devote yourself completely to the Lord. That's why he says it's better. He says, a woman, but if her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wants. But he must belong to the Lord. I want to address that real quick. Nothing broke my heart more, or breaks my heart more, than to see some awesome Christian girl who goes out and starts dating some knucklehead that doesn't care a thing in the world about the Lord, and she's going to rescue him. She's going to show him Jesus. And I have very rarely seen that happen. I'll think about it. I'm trying to think right now. I can't think of a time where it did happen. But I can sure think of times where it went the complete opposite. Starts this beautiful Christian girl starts dating this knucklehead loser that's not a Christian, and we beg her, please don't do this. Please don't rescue date. It's not what you think. Please don't do this. Badly. Please don't do this. And they go out and they do it, and before you know it, this girl has completely forsaken all of her commitments to the Lord. She has been pulled down to this moron's level instead of being able to lift him up like she really had this vision of doing. I hate to be that blunt about it, but it has broken my heart. And me and Jenny both, it has broken our hearts to watch these Christian girls go out and try and rescue date some loser dude. I got news for you. If you are unmarried, if you are single and you're still dating, do not date an unbeliever if you're a believer. The chances are far greater that it's going to go the opposite way of what you want it to go. Matter of fact, your first rule for dating should be what?
Is he a Christian?
Do they love the Lord? Is he a Christian? That's exactly right. Except for Rich. Better not ask if he's a Christian. See if she's a Christian, right? Do they love the Lord? Do they love the Lord? That's the very first question you ask. One of our elders always uses this illustration. If you're standing on top of a rock and there's people down at the base of the big rock, is it easier for you to pull people up to the top of the rock, or is it easier for them to pull you off of the rock? The answer is it's easier always to pull somebody down off of that rock. And in your faith, if you're not careful, you will get pulled down just like that. He says, in my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. What Paul's saying here is, look, if your husband dies and you know what, you're free to get married again, you're better off if you don't. But if you do get married, do not marry a knucklehead, unbelieving loser. Now, that's the Kurt Honeken version of this passage. He says it a lot nicer than that. But after watching this happen so many times, it just breaks my heart. And so I'm kind of passionate about that. Make sure that your relationships reflect your love for the Lord. And in doing so, make sure you choose well in your relationships, that might glorify the Lord in your relationship. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for Paul. Thank you for giving him the words to write to the church in Corinth. And Lord, I thank you that the words in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 are just as true today as they were 2,000 years ago. Father, help us to commit ourselves to you so that every area of life we can be content and that we can honor and glorify you in whatever situation we find ourselves. Father, help us to show the rest of the world what it looks like to be completely devoted to you. Father, we love you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.